man. I know you were here today.
All right.
Of course.
I'll go ahead and get started. So, first of all, my name is Mason Youngblood, and I'm a new postdoc here as of August, and I do work on cultural evolution very broadly. Some of that is in birdsong, which was my focus in grad school, but I also do work in music and behavior on social media. And I have a stutter that will pop up periodically. Just a heads up. So today I'm talking about a new project I've been working on in the last couple of months, looking at the presence of language-like efficiency and structure in house finch song. I'm calling it language-like so as to not be too terribly provocative in my title, but basically I'm looking at the presence of linguistic laws in house finch song. So I thought I would introduce with just some of the basics of what we know about house finch song, and then transition over into the actual content of this paper. So here is what a house finch song actually looks like. So house finch songs, like other bird songs, are comprised of subunits which we call syllables. And this is a spectrogram, time on the x-axis, frequency or pitch on the y-axis, and you can read it kind of like sheet music. The average house finch typically knows between 30 to 60 different types of syllables, and then they can combine those into between 1 and 7 different song types. So it's quite a complex system. And here's what this song was recorded in 1975 by Paul Mundinger near Jones Beach, and this is what it sounds like. So it's quite fast and it's hard to hear the details, so here's a slowed down version. So the primary function of house finch song is in courtship. So male house finches sing to attract mates. It's not the only cue used in courtship. The coloration of males is also very important, but song does play a big role. The other important aspect of song is that it is socially learned. So juvenile house finches learn these songs of the adults around them, which means that it culturally evolves over long periods of time. And by cultural evolution here, I just mean changes in socially learned behavior of populations over time and space. In fact, house finch song is, I think, the oldest form of animal communication to be talked about in a cultural evolution framework in the early 70s by Paul Mundinger. House finches were introduced to this area in the early 50s and started rapidly expanding across the East Coast. They are from California and Mexico, and Paul Mundinger became very interested in them because of the fact that they have quite distinct dialects in different parts of their range, And so he was taking a lot of house finch recordings to try and capture those changes in real time as the species expanded its range. My lab in grad school collected more house finch recordings in 2012 and found that the dialect boundaries have become less strict and distinct over time, and that the overall song and syllable diversity has increased. But at the time, we didn't really understand why those changes had occurred. So a big project I did a couple of years ago was investigating whether or not those changes could be explained, at least in part, by biased learning. So in the field of cultural evolution, we often talk about these three forms of biased learning, also called cultural transmission biases. The first is a content bias, and that's when the content of what is being learned biases individuals towards it. So a species might be more likely to learn something that is more complex as opposed to something that is simpler. A frequency bias is when how common or rare a behavior is biases its adoption, so conformity versus anti-conformity. And then a demonstrator bias is when some aspect of the individuals that the birds are learning from biases the adoption of behavior. There's not actually very good evidence for this outside of us, but in humans, the most commonly discussed form of this is prestige bias. So to detect this in the cultural dynamics of the historical data, I built an agent-based model where generations of birds are born, they learn song from a previous generation, and then they die with mortality based on the real population. And I encoded these three forms of bias in their learning process. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but if you're interested afterwards, I can send you a link. But basically, the biases are encoded here. It also includes an innovation rate as well. I trained a machine learning classifier to predict the input parameters from the output that they generate, and I gave it the real data, and it found a strong signal for a content bias, and we followed up and found that concavity, which is a proxy for how complex the syllables are in structure, was probably the target of this bias. So it seems like male house finches are more likely to learn syllables that are more complex. So why would this be the case? Well, it's probably because female house finches have a preference for more complex song. So songs used in courtship are more complex and more long. And the males that sing these more complex songs get more attention from females and have offspring earlier on in the spring than males who sing less complex songs. So I think that this this learning bias among males is an adaptation in response to female preferences for more complex song. And then one last important piece of background for this project is that efficiency of song is also very important. So if house finches are tutored with canary song, which has these very fast and long trills, they slow down the trills and they make them shorter in length to be closer to the typical structure of house finch song. And then there has been a great deal of work on the impact of urban noise in house finches. So urban noise is usually at these lower frequencies, and populations of house finches that live in urban environments sing at a slightly higher frequency, so as to not be masked as much by noise. These are just a couple of examples, but we expect house finches to be subject to a variety of efficiency-related constraints that have been well documented in other songbird species. So just to summarize all of the background I just gave you that's relevant for this project. So song is used in courtship and it culturally evolves. It seems as though males have a bias for more complex syllables, possibly as an adaptation for female preferences for more complex song.
Yeah, I think maybe I missed it, but what makes a syllable complex versus simple?
Yes, I'm going to go into that in more detail in a few slides,
Okay.
but the way that we quantify it is how many times the frequency changes in slope per unit time. So something that goes like this is more complex than something that goes like this. Yeah. And then efficiency also plays an important role in constraining song features. So why am I covering all of this? Well, I'm covering all of this because this project is about how songs get through what people call the bottleneck of cultural transmission. So in all forms of communication, there are a variety of different constraints, environmental constraints that affect how signals pass through the environment, social constraints that affect what signals an individual that is learning has access to, like population size and population turnover, and then individual constraints. What kinds of sounds can individual birds produce, and what types of sounds are easier or harder to learn. And all of these things in combination are thought to impose selection for efficiency. So selection for behaviors that are easier to compress when they are being learned and easier to produce while still being functional. And my favorite definition of efficiency comes from this paper from Thibaut Gruber and colleagues in 2021. That efficiency in communication is the ratio of the lifetime benefits that communication provides over the cost of learning that communication system plus the lifetime cost of producing the communication system. There are a few things that aren't included here, like the costs of perception on the part of the receiver. So this is efficiency on the part of the individual producing the communication. All right, so where does complexity come in here? Well, in general, we would expect increased complexity to increase the top of this function because of the fact that more complex signals can vary in a larger number of ways. So in language, more complex signals allow you to encode more meanings. In birdsong, it allows you to have more types of song that can be the subject of female preferences. But of course, complexity does not just change the top of this, it also changes the bottom. More complex things might be harder to learn and harder to produce. But first, of course, the complexity is defined completely differently in different fields. It's notoriously vague. So in birdsong, complexity usually means one of three things. So syllable complexity, which my favorite way of quantifying this is transitions in the slope of pitch per unit time. And then I'll jump ahead here because these are more closely linked. If you're comparing across populations of songbirds or different species, people often use repertoire size, or the overall number of unique syllables or songs that a species can sing. Both of these deal with the cost of production primarily, well, also the cost of learning here. But then there's song complexity. And in birdsong, this is usually the degree of combinatorial structure in the syntax. So if you look here, there are several sequences of syllables that recur multiple times, and they sometimes appear along other combinations. And so the degree of that combinatorial structure is used as a metric of song complexity. This is slightly different than these because, in general, more structured signals should be easier to compress and learn based on studies in linguistics and information theoretic models. So the expectations of how these affect efficiency are slightly different. We expect increasing syllable complexity and repertoire size to increase costs, and increased song complexity to decrease costs. And I would love to talk about this with all of the linguists in the room, because I have only been reading this literature for a couple of months, and so I would love to get your take on it. But for now, assuming that this is right, over the course of multiple generations, this pressure for efficiency and its corresponding relationship with complexity leads to interesting things. So there have been a lot of iterated learning studies of language that show that initially complex artificial languages become more efficient over time, easier to learn and use, and they also gain structure over time. And there are only a handful of experimental studies in birds, but they show loosely similar things. Oh, uh-oh. Jumping ahead. So, most of this work has been done in zebra finches. So if you raise zebra finches in isolation, they sing isolate song, which is less efficient, a bit more chaotic than standard zebra finch song. If you then allow those isolate birds to coexist alongside one another for a few generations, these songs compress, these syllables become shorter, and they gain more structure. And the same thing happens if you raise them with the songs of other species. They become more compressed and gain more species-typical structure over time. And then most recently, it was found that if a zebra finch is learning from a male who does not have much diversity in his song, they spontaneously invent new types to bring the complexity of the song up. So they learn the song less accurately because they are increasing the diversity of the syntax. And vice versa. If a bird is learning song from a male who already has quite complex song with a diverse syntax, then they learn it quite accurately. So it seems that there are existing biases for balancing this complexity efficiency trade-off. So if we zoom out and we think about how all of these things affect the structure of communication over many, many generations, we can think about how the biases that the individuals learning the communication system have affect how that system looks to the next generation of birds, how that in turn changes the fitness landscape, which in turn can lead to selection for learning biases, like a content bias for complexity, and this goes on, and the output is the structure of the communication system. Okay, so now we are getting to what I mean when I say language like efficiency and structure in Finch song. And so here I'm going to go over 5 different things, the 3 most often discussed linguistic laws that are often explored in other species, and then 2 more recent ways of quantifying structure in signals that have been explored in both language and other species. So the 3 linguistic laws here are Zipf's rank frequency law, Zipf's law of abbreviation, and Menzerath's law. So if you can imagine that you have a set of units of different size, where size here is really a proxy for the cost of producing the signal, and then those units are combined into sequences. These 3 laws have been found to hold across, I think, all human languages that they've been looked at in, as well as a variety of other forms of communication, including writing systems. So the first one, Zipf's rank frequency law, predicts that if you plot the frequency of items on the y-axis and the rank of those items on the x-axis, it should be linear on a log-log scale, or it should be a power law. There's an extension of this that Mandelbrot introduced in the early 50s that allows this relationship to be slightly more complex, and that is the form that is most heavily used now in contemporary linguistics, I think, and is also most often looked at in other species. In general, both Zipf and Mandelbrot interpreted this as resulting from pressure for communicative efficiency, but the explanations are quite diverse in linguistics as to why this emerges, including that it's just an epiphenomena of other things happening at a much lower level, that it emerges from communicative efficiency, but with models that require a mapping of signals to objects in the world or concepts, and a variety of other things. So I'm not really interpreting the results related to this very strongly. But these 2 have a much more intuitive interpretation. So Zipf's law of abbreviation predicts that items that have a higher production cost are going to be more rare, whereas items that have a low production cost are going to be more common. And then Menzerath's law predicts that sequences that are longer are going to, on average, be comprised of smaller units and vice versa. And the idea there is that if you increase the production cost in one domain, you need to decrease it in another. The next 2 are not traditional linguistic laws, but just relate to general structure. So the first is small world structure in the transitions between syllables. So if you construct a transition network from sequences in language, or in this case, humpback whale song, then you can map out the probability that the appearance of this syllable is followed by this one. And the thickness here is the probability weight. And then you can look at the extent to which this transition network has a small world structure. Small world structures are structures where it only takes a couple of jumps to move from one position in the network to another, or in more concrete terms, where the ratio of the clustering coefficient to the average path length is greater than 1. So it's more clustered than it is broad. And in general, small world structure is thought to reflect just general systematic structure. It's quite general. It doesn't reflect any specific form of structure besides systematic structure. The more specific structural property I looked at is mutual information decay. In this great paper from 2019, Steinberg et al. Showed quite elegantly that if the underlying structure of sequences is just hierarchical, then the mutual information decay between sequential items follows a power law. And mutual information here is the amount of information that the presence of one thing has about another. So this is the amount of information that, in this case, words have about the very next word at a distance of 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and on and on. They found that Markov chains produce an exponential decay, and that if you have Markov chains that are nested within a larger hierarchical structure, so Markov chains at short distances, hierarchical structure at long distances, then you end up with a decay that looks like this. And they found that in a set of 4 languages, English, German, Italian, and Japanese, the structure best fits this composite model of Markov chains that are nested within a larger hierarchical structure. And they also looked at 4 species of birds and found the same thing, although it's not quite as good. These are the 5 properties I'm looking at, but there's one more piece of nuance to add in here, which is that in human language, we know what all of the important units are because we speak languages. So in English, I know what all of the phonemes are because I'm an English speaker. It's easy to parse up and analyze. Well, it's not easy, but it's possible. It's possible. In birdsong, we don't know what the important units are because we aren't birds. So there's this issue where our decisions about how to cluster vocalizations into categories can have an impact on our conclusions about the presence versus absence and the strength of these linguistic laws and structural properties. And this was most recently found in a study in Gibbons that found that if you look at a higher level of structure, you find evidence for Zipf's law of abbreviation, but you don't find it if you look at a lower level of structure. So we need to account for this. Okay, so after all of that, we are finally at the aims of this project. I apologize for a very long intro. So the first aim is there evidence for these linguistic laws and structural properties in House Finch song? And if so, how does that evidence change across levels of granularity in syllable clustering? So the data is the same data I used in to detect a learning bias for more complex syllables. It's 2,700 songs from 330 individuals in Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island across this range. And just a reminder, these songs look like this. And the way that we analyze them is we take the mean frequency traces of all of the syllables in all of the songs, and we use dynamic time warping to calculate a distance measure between all of them. And then we do hierarchical clustering on those distances to identify types. And then the granularity comes in how we, at the granularity at which we identify those types. So here is a dendrogram produced from all of the distances, dynamic tree cut, which is the form of hierarchical clustering I used, has this basic parameter called deep split that we have used in previous house finch projects. This deep split of equal to 3 is what we've used previously, and we did a manual check to make sure that the syllable types identified when deep split equals 3, that they match on to the intuitions of manual annotators. So a deep split of 2 over lumps syllables into types, you end up with about a quarter of the types that you get with the deep split equals 3, whereas the deep split equals 4 over splits them into types. So this is kind of the standard granularity that's used in house finch research. This is this is higher granularity, and this is smaller granularity. So I did all the analyses at all 3 levels of deep split when it's relevant. All right, so now we'll go through all of the results. I'll have this appear so you can refer to it throughout. So starting out with, and all of the analyses were run in STAN, with the BRMS package in R. All the models were fit with MCMC. So first, for tips rank frequency law, I fit the extension of it that was done by Mandelbrot, as well as the original. The difference between those two is if this beta parameter is there or not. So if it's not there, it simplifies to the original Zipf's rank frequency law, and if it's there, then it's the Zipf Mandelbrot. So all these are on a log-log scale, and the Zipf Mandelbrot fits better across all 3 levels of granularity, but both of them fit reasonably well. The R squared for the Zipf Mandelbrot is above 0.995 for all 3, and for Zipf it's 0.92, 0.65, and 0.45. For Zipf's law of abbreviation, here's a plot of just what the data looks like, and this is averaged across all of the types. So just for the purposes of this plot, I'm averaging all of these measures, and you can see that for all of them except concavity, there's a very clear relationship where the syllable types that are more common, that have a higher count, tend to have a lower production cost. Usually Zipf's law of abbreviation only deals with the duration of items, but here I used 4 metrics of cost: duration, bandwidth, concavity, and that's the number of transitions in the slope of pitch per unit time. And then excursion is basically if you have something like this and you stretch it out, how long is it? And so if we run the analysis where we do not take the averages, we include all of the observations of each type and then include type as a varying intercept, there's a strong relationship between cost and count for all of these except concavity, and then it's only a very weak one at the fourth grain. But we do see it for 3 out of the 4 measures. The third one is Menzerath's law. There's a complication with this one because it's been shown that you can get a correlation between sequence length and item length in completely random sequences, depending on the distribution of items. So if you already have Zipf's law of abbreviation and you produce random sequences from it, you can end up with Menzerath's law completely as an artifact. So I think there are 2 kinds of null models that make sense to compare here. The first is just completely random sequences, and the other was introduced by James et al. A couple of years ago, which is you construct pseudo-random sequences that are forced to fit the duration and time of actual songs. So basically you have a big list of how long all of your songs are in your data set, and you randomly sample syllables until you meet that length, which a couple of extra rules that you can check out in my working paper if you want. So if we, the actual data looks like this. There is a negative relationship, and in orange, that is the full posterior distribution for that relationship from the real data. The green is the posterior distribution from a model fit on 10 separate data sets produced from this null model, which is thought to reflect production constraints alone. And then in blue, that is the posterior from 10 sets of random sequences. And you can see that the slope for the observed data is stronger than the slopes from the 2 null models. So it seems that when items are longer, they are comprised of shorter syllables. And this is the only analysis that where the granularity did not come into play, because Menzerath's law is about the average length of the items in a sequence rather than the average length of the types of items in this sequence. So your granularity of clustering does not play a role here, unless you include it as a varying intercept, which I did, and it didn't improve model fit. Small world structure. So here's what a transition network of a single male house finch's full syllable repertoire looks like. And if you combine all of them, it looks like this. And the small world index that I used here, the top of it is the clustering coefficient over the clustering coefficient of a completely random network, and the bottom is the average path length of the actual over a random network. At all 3 levels of deep split, the small worldness of the actual sequences was higher than for pseudo-random sequences, which were randomly shuffled versions of the actual sequences to respect the skew in the frequency. Because if you have a very high skew in the items in your corpus and you construct a transition network from completely random sequences, you can still end up with a small world structure just because the common things end up as very important nodes in your network. And then lastly, if we look at the mutual information decay, if you'd like, I can go into more detail into how it was calculated. But just a reminder, if it's a power law, that reflects hierarchical structure. If it's exponential, it's Markov structure. And if it's a composite of the two, it's both. And I found that at all 3 levels of deep split, the composite fits much, much better than the other 2 options. So that is all of the results, and the conclusions for now are that house finch song appears to have efficiency and structure that is very loosely like language, suggesting that it's subject to similar constraints. And these patterns are robust across grains of analysis, pointing to a limited form of scale invariance, and I use the word limited because it's invariance across grains of analysis within a scale, which is syllables. And there are just a couple things I want to briefly mention before we discuss. So there's this whole debate in the field of cultural evolution about cumulative cultural evolution if other species have it. There are a ton of different definitions of this, and it's very contentious, but basically the concept of cumulative culture was proposed by Mike Tomasello to explain the fact that in human culture, we get this ratcheting effect of efficiency and complexity over time that leads to more advanced cultural forms that serve their function more effectively. And we don't really seem to see this in other species. But it's increasingly debated about whether or not birdsong is an example of this. In birdsong, we have a really huge range of complexity across a different species, and we already know that the complexity of birdsong is a combination of cultural and biological evolution. And just last week, this paper came out that showed that species that have more complex song also have more open-ended learning and larger brains. So we also get this interesting feedback where when your communication is more complex, your problem-solving behavior is more complex and your brain size increases. And then we have more small-scale examples, like this paper from last year in savanna sparrows that showed an increase in the number of clicks in their songs and showed that the more complex songs with more clicks are more preferred by females and lead to higher reproductive success. So an increase in complexity that leads to a better outcome. And in the last couple of years, this idea has taken hold, especially in the idea of efficiency playing a key role in cumulative culture when we're talking about it in other species. In humans, it's very clear when cultural traits become more complex over time. In other species, it's not. So efficiency might be a better metric. In species like house finches, where we know there's pressure for increasing complexity, and there's also good evidence for pressure for efficiency as well, might be a good candidate for studies of cumulative culture in other species. And then future steps. I'm really interested in this idea that a non-human cultural behavior is very important from a conservation standpoint. There's increasing awareness of this. This is a science opinion piece that came out, I think last year, that outlines all the evidence for why cultural behaviors in other species are important from a conservation perspective. And there was recently a study in this critically endangered species called regent honeyeaters that as their population size has crashed, their cultural diversity and complexity has also crashed. And because that's used in female preferences, that's caused a positive feedback loop on their fitness outcomes. And I'm really interested in trying to communicate this issue to the public in a multimedia installation format. And this was inspired by this recent album by an artist named Debit, who has Mayan ancestry and took a corpus of endangered Mayan flute music, trained a deep neural network to produce a large number of flute songs with higher complexity than the original corpus, and then composed an album with it. And so I'm working on training a deep neural network with corpora of endangered birdsong to try to produce an evidence-based composition that tracks the extinction of birdsong over time. And I got some grant funding for it, which is good, a little seed grant. So that's it. If you're interested in the paper, you can check it out here. And I would love to talk about any questions you have.
Hi, thank you for the talk. This was very interesting. I'm coming from the perspective of a linguist, so I work with people instead of birds, but there are obvious parallels, as you point out. And so I feel like I have to push back against the interpretation of Zipf's law of abbreviation as implying efficiency. So you mentioned this for the other ones, but it's also true for the law of abbreviation that there could be, and there, for language at least, likely are completely random, non-optimizing processes that can cause it. So the famous paper here is Miller 1957, which it's a mathematical proof that's like 3 pages long, which shows that random typing processes do this. There's a follow-up, there was Chomsky 63, which showed that if you were to take a large English text and split the words on the letter E instead of on spaces, you actually get a better fit to Zipf's law than you do for the actual language.
And is that for abbreviation or the rank frequency law?
For Chomsky, I don't remember. I think it was for abbreviation.
Yeah.
But Miller's definitely was.
Yeah.
So I think this point is important. I think the fact that we continually see also for the other Zipf's law that in systems that have nothing to do with efficiency, so like the rate that people choose television channels follows this as well. I think it then means that showing that birdsong is in some way human-like then tells us very little about to what extent it is optimized for efficiency.
I think
because
that's
we don't know the answer for human language really either.
So I think that's a great critique, but I think that there's a major difference, which is that the default for animal vocalizations is generally, if a species has multiple types of vocalizations, they're approximately the same length. They're basically variations of the same thing. And so moving from a place where there is no real variation in item length to a place where you get a very strong relationship between item length and frequency, I think is very different from like the logic of a random typing model. And I think I understand the critique of the random typing model, but it's very hard to apply in a concrete way to other species communication systems. And so I think in general, if you think about the evolution of more complex song in birds, where you're moving from a place where items are usually the same length to a place where there's this massive skew, then I think it seems to me like it's clearly driven by pressure for efficiency.
So I have a suggestion for you, which would be a sort of like the continuous rather than discrete interpretation of Miller's study. Could you go back to the slide where I think you had 4 measures, duration, something.
Oh, yes.
And then the last one is excursivity.
Yeah, so you do.
Right. So With Miller, when we're talking about language, we're talking about sequences of discrete phones making up an entire word.
Yeah.
The equivalent here then is, if you don't have words, these are the syllables, right? Is it and I think you could check this easily, like, are there just more possible long syllables in terms of duration than short syllables? Or for excursion,
Oh.
are there more possible highly excursive syllables than very low excursive syllables? Because if this is the case,
That's a really good.
then there are just more, if there are just more possible long syllables, than if you were to sample long syllables, any given one will appear less often. That's the same reasoning behind Miller's random typing.
Yeah. I'm giving this talk next week to a birdsong lab, and I'll talk to them about that because I don't know.
You should be able to test it with the data you have here as well.
Except that this, compared with the size of like a linguistic corpus, this is very small. It's only 330 birds. So I think that.
I don't think that would matter.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look into it. The other issue though is that the hierarchical clustering algorithm also is likely to treat length. Like, it accounts for length because of the fact that the distances are calculated with dynamic time warping, but still, I think things that are smaller might get clumped with each other more just as a byproduct of this.
You can run it with a higher than normal split,
Yeah.
a deeper split.
Yeah, like a really, really high split and see if you still see
Or
it.
just try all three of these and see if it actually matters or not.
Okay, yeah,
Like you have all the data to do it, it looks like.
yeah, I think so. Okay, yeah, I'll look into that. That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, my question, you had mentioned that in English or many languages, we already know what the phones are. But I was wondering to what extent people have looked at whether these kinds of clustering methods can accurately return the kinds of what the phones we think exist in English or other languages are. People try to take human speech in the wild, so to speak, and then apply the same clustering methods to see if they actually get the phones that we believe we have in English.
I'm not aware of anyone who has done that.
I think that'd be interesting to look at just to see to what extent how much we can rely on these kinds of methods.
Wait. No, I'm wrong. Steinberg, the guy who did the mutual information decay study.
Okay, I'll look at that paper. Yeah, I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
so I
it's
know that
great.
one.
So he has another project where he uses UMAP on spectrograms of human speech, a few mammal vocalizations, and a bunch of different bird species. And I don't know if he compares the results to like actual phonemes. It might be in the SI, but yeah, it might be in that paper. I'll check.
And then I'm going to run the slide up because my other question has to do with this claim that I guess it's the Steinberg et al. Paper again that's making this claim that the sort of this mutual information decay can be indicative of is it Markovian or hierarchical structure.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little skeptical of that claim, and I guess I'll look at their paper in more detail. Can you explain the intuition they have about or what their argument is for how the mutual information is going to tell you something about whether you have a hierarchical structure versus a Markovian structure? Like why do they say that these signatures will correspond to Markovian, hierarchical, or both?
I mean, in general, the intuition is just that the structure that generates the sequences that you are looking at affects the amount of information that items have about what comes next at different distances. And then there's not much of a causal claim, it's more so a descriptive claim about how the shape of that decay reflects. So in this paper, and then also in the Lin and Tegmark paper, and in the Katahira paper, they use a different generative models of grammar to create simulated data of known source, and then do this analysis with it. And so that's really where the claim is coming from. They have these generative models, they do the analysis with that, and then they do the analysis with real data. But honestly, the math of it is over my head enough that I'm not really able to
Okay, but they're, yes,
explain
they
why.
take known generative models and they construct artificial data, and then they found these kinds of,
Yes.
using information indicator, they found these kinds of sort of signatures.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So I don't know anything at all about linguistics or your analytical methods, but I do know about evolution and about birds. And of course, you started out by describing that there was evidence that female house finches prefer more complex songs. And so it seems to me like the other side of language is not just the production, but the reception and response to it, right? And so I'm curious about what is known about basically what's in it for the females. I mean, so there's big literature in sexual selection, as you know, not only showing, arguing that certain features of males are appealing to females, but also then asking what is in it for the female to have that preference. Okay, and so I'm wondering, do we have any idea why female house finches or other birds should prefer more complex songs, which then translates into what you described as the cultural evolution and the spread of these song types as the house finches have expanded in the East. Do we know anything about what it is in the songs that females might be responding to, in terms of the components of the complexity, and is there an advantage to the females really in having that preference?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, the classic dogma that my PhD advisor would say is that the ability to produce complex songs reflects something about the quality of the male, maybe how good their working memory is,
et
cetera, and that reflects. Oh, well, now there's this evidence that more complex song reflects better problem-solving ability if you compare across species, so it's possible that claim is true, but unfortunately no good studies have been done in house finches on exactly why females prefer complex songs, just that they do. I really wanted
zebra finches, no evidence in zebra finches?
I'm not aware of it, but admittedly I've been out of the weeds of the birdsong stuff for a couple of years, so it's possible that something has come out. But I really wanted to, in grad school, do a study where we captured males, we recorded their songs, we recorded their testosterone levels, their cortisol levels, we took measurements of how red their plumage is, and then I do a big analysis of it all to figure out how it all correlates, because it's really complex in house finches, because how much color the males have corresponds to their immunity. Testosterone depresses immunity. Testosterone makes them more likely to sing and more dominant and territorial over other males, but it also makes them worse at parenting. And so female birds, by having a preference for males with more color, are indirectly choosing for males with lower testosterone and better immune function. But it's unclear how that then relates to song. It's really interesting, but I tried doing it and I just couldn't catch enough male birds. It was too difficult. But that's a really interesting question, and it's kind of the missing piece of this puzzle for me.
So I'm not a biologist, so this is going to be a very brief follow-up. Couldn't it just be the same case as peacock feathers? Basically, it's a costly signal to spend resources on useless crap like that.
Yeah,
And so the fact that you can do that and you're still alive shows you're a good mate.
Yeah, so,
That's sort of the classic sexual selection hypothesis.
yeah. And there are a lot of people who think that. And a book came out a few years ago that made that claim very strongly, and it was very controversial.
What book was that?
This is Something of Beauty by
Prum.
Yeah. And I had it hammered into me in grad school that there are models that show that that's not the case, but more recently I've become a little more open-minded about it, and I'm not sure where I stand on that, about whether or not kind of the elaboration of traits simply because they are costly can kind of positive feedback loop out of the standard selective logic. Yeah, I'm on the fence.
So am I.
Yeah, interesting.
There's another question, how you got the, or how people get the transition networks out of the songs they actually have captured.
Yeah.
Like you showed that hump whale song, and then you mentioned that you were also making transition networks out of the bird songs that you had. So how do you do that?
So when you, I have all of the songs and song sequences, or just all of the audio of all the songs. I analyze them to identify the type of each syllable.
Right.
And then I end up with basically a list of like A, B, B, B,
Right.
C, D, E, F.
Right.
And then I bring all of those into R and build a network out of it. Which means that
So just like two nodes are connected if they appear like back to back.
Yep. And that's why like this network is just built from one male, so it's
Right.
pretty sparse. And this one is built from everyone, so it's
Right.
really dense because basically I build this out of the first male and then I just add male 2 onto it and
Right.
male 3 and male 4, so it becomes more dense over time as I add more birds to it.
Okay.
I have a question related to that. Is that graph meant to be for one song or for all of the songs superimposed on top of each other? And related to that, to what extent are songs actually distinct, like say, our music?
That's a great question. So this is all the songs sung by a male, and I think this male had like 4 or 5 songs. And yes,
So they're
it's
overlaid.
yeah, they're overlaid. So like from here around this loop might be a song, and then from here this way up to here might be a song, and then this might be a song, and you get the overlapping loops because there are
Shared material.
combinations of syllables that are shared. Yeah.
There was something that was unclear to me in this talk, but to be fair, it's also usually unclear to me in papers on cultural evolution or on language. To what extent is efficiency or the drive for efficiency in itself meant to play a causal role here, and to what extent is it just emergent from these other factors?
Oh, I mean, by other factors, do you mean the costs of learning and production? And the benefits that the communication gives?
Or more mechanical than that. So like specifically you talked about, again, the song coming through noise, right?
Yeah.
So like I assume there are like acoustic properties of the song that make it easier, say, for recipients of the song to pick it up, right, to understand it. So like, is the bird trying to make an efficient song? Or
No. So I'm of the opinion that efficiency is, like, I'm taking this equation at face value. That efficiency is a vague concept that's proportional to all the benefits and all the costs that are entailed.
And this is
And that includes the cost of of being in a noisy environment, how hard it is to produce particular sounds with your hearings, all of that stuff.
So then it's just a description of the overall system by the researcher. So things like the sum of the lifetime benefit, like there's no way the bird could get that number.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, in general, I think it's quite common for strong pressure for efficiency in communication or tool use or other cultural behaviors to eventually lead to cognitive biases for proxies of it over the course of biological evolution. But that's kind of a special case, and in general, I think it's just emergent. Yeah.
So then this is pretty different from a lot of the claims, as far as I can tell, being made in the linguistic literature on efficiency, where they're claiming that that in the moment choices for efficiency on behalf of the speakers are what's driving the correlations with the metric of efficiency.
Well, so I'm speaking as primarily an animal researcher. So, and I think like when for example the Kirby lab and other labs that do iterated learning studies talk about efficiency, it is a bit different because it's like if you are doing an iterated learning study and you tell the participants that their output is going to be the input for another participant, they behave differently than if you don't tell them that. And so I think that indicates that there is some higher level cognitive stuff happening in humans in those experiments that would not happen if you had birds in a lab, because
Yeah, so in that case, I think the comparisons to the linguistic literature are a bit misleading, to the extent that I like this more than I did a couple of minutes ago.
awesome. That's great. Yeah. I mean, Thibaut Gruber, this is a great paper, by the way, but he's a chimpanzee researcher, and he does work on tool use in gestures in chimpanzees, and he's trained as a behavioral ecologist. So his perspective, I think, is I think it's very refreshing if you come from the human literature.
This actually is sort of part two, I guess, in some sense, of my previous question, which is in biological evolution, as you know, one of the critical components is the heritability of a trait, which you can think of as the correlation between individuals and their descendants with respect to some trait. And query, there can be a heritability of a cultural trait, right? To what extent sons resemble their fathers, for example, in song. Do we know anything about the heritability of, say, any of your complexity measures?
Great question. The complexity measures directly, no, with the exception of repertoire size. I think there have been studies of that in other species. But in house finches, we got an estimate of the innovation rate from the agent-based modeling paper, where we fit the agent-based model to the actual data, and the innovation rate is one of the things we estimated, and it was, I think, 2%.
Is this innovation with respect to, let's say, compared to the father song, or the entire population of songs?
Compared to the songs of the demonstrators, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So a bird learns from more than one bird, and it's the innovation rate with respect to that content. And another similar study in song sparrows that also did the same pipeline of agent-based modeling and comparison with the real data, also got an innovation rate of about 2%. And they predicted that song types and song sparrows can persist for up to hundreds of years.
So there's sort of high heritability in this
Yeah.
very loose sense that I'm using.
Yeah, I think so. But there are some like major caveats. So, like I mentioned, this project where if a bird is learning from a male who sings low quality songs, they spontaneously improvise to produce more complex songs. So, low heritability, high heritability. And the problem is with field studies where we just have a bunch of recordings of birds and then we're simulating what's happening. All of these sorts of things just aren't really present in the data, and so I think the heritability is probably way lower than what we estimate, just because the birds have evolved all of these biases for taking a bunch of content and producing structured communication with it. But yeah, this area of how birds transform the content that they learn during the process of learning is very new. It's very, very new.
Sorry if this was asked, giant art MFA emergency, as always happens, beginning of the semester. Anyway, the fact that you're like, this is so far beyond like your computational modeling, but like the female birds appreciate longer and more complex sounds, right? You're saying evolutionarily it's good for the males to develop this, but why do the females have that preference? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah. So we had a discussion about that, and the compressed answer is that kind of the standard adaptationist dogma is that the ability for a male to sing complex songs must reflect something about him, like his ability to learn, his
So it's intelligence.
which reflects problem solving based on this a paper that came out last week that found a correlation between song complexity and open-ended learning and problem solving and brain size. So it's possible that there's a clear, concrete link. But then there's an alternate explanation which was brought up that some people in behavioral ecology think that if something like a peacock tail gets so costly and complex that a male's ability to produce it in spite of how horrible it is to have is indicative of just his hardiness in general.
Right.
Then that coevolution can take on a life of its own, basically. And I'm kind of on the fence about both of those. I don't know where I stand. Yeah.
I'm curious about talking about like the different cultures of like the same bird. And we're saying how the house finches are spreading out all around places. So if like the evolution and changing of their song or adjustments to it over generations might have to do with the like available frequency ranges in whatever new environment they're in. I was also wondering if in cases like that where maybe the frequency ranges are different than they're used to, if maybe they have the same syllables that are just pitched up, or if they could be all different syllables, or how that affects everything.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are two studies that I think are very relevant here. One of them showed that if you have male house finches in a lab and you play white noise, they choose to sing the syllable types that do not overlap as much with that white noise. And so some people think that the increased frequency in urban environments is a plastic response on the part of males when they sing. But there are other people who don't think that experiment was very well conducted, who think that it's actually just kind of a large-scale cultural process. And then there's this other paper that came out a couple years ago that, so house finches who live in urban areas primarily eat at bird feeders, which have larger seeds than the seeds that they're used to eating. So if you compare the bill depth of house finches in urban areas, it's slightly larger than in rural areas. And because of that, they sing slightly deeper songs, in spite of the fact that slightly deeper songs clash more with the urban noise. So there's a lot going on with the noise stuff, but I think that's cool because then if you compare the actual songs of the urban birds with the big bills and the rural birds with the smaller bills, the lowest frequency that they sing is about the same, in spite of the fact that you would expect the urban birds to sing slightly lower songs. So it's like their range is getting pushed down, but they're like, oh, I still have to keep it up here. So in general, that might end up meaning that they're not able to make as complex of stuff because their range is smaller.
So yeah, I was wondering if you had like maybe one population is north and one is south or something, and maybe they're both rural, but just the environment they're in is different. The kind of open ranges are different. Would you hear different songs or different syllables being used by those two populations?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
This map that at the very beginning of the talk, I had this map from the paper in the 1970s, and this map was based on that. So it's based on Paul Mundinger going out with his massive tape recorder and recording birds with a big microphone, and then just listening to it and being like, oh, these are type A, these are type C, in areas that are just like a 10-minute drive away from each other.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have a maybe contentious question.
Awesome.
Based on the 5 day ago paper, whenever that one came out. The new one.
Which one?
The one you were just on before.
The 2-week-old one?
The 2-week-old one.
Oh, the open-ended learning paper.
Yes. So to me, it basically, if I'm understanding correct, it's saying like birds with more complex songs can do more complex problem solving and have bigger brains. Is that a claim to do? So is this bird eugenics? Because if we say the same thing about, say, like human language, that would seem very eugenic-y, right? Like,
Yeah.
are Danish speakers better problem solvers because they have a huge vowel inventory than Arabic speakers who have like 3 vowels?
So it's not eugenics because these are different species. So
Well,
okay, it's very clear. Like,
It's bird
eugenics,
genetics.
right?
so,
But it's similar logic, right?
yeah.
Slippery slope, Mason, slippery slope.
Yeah. I mean, as an evolution person, I think my feet are always kind of dangling on
Yeah,
that slippery slope. But it's not eugenics for 2 reasons, I think. One is the scale, so a different species.
Sure.
I think it's uncontroversial that humans' vocal communication and problem solving in general, cognitive ability is higher than chimps and bonobos, and yeah. And the other reason is that we're a different species investigating these other species rather than like I'm a northern cardinal saying, see how big my repertoire is and how good my problem solving is.
Yeah, I was thinking also, I can't remember if it's a preprint or an actual publication that came out also earlier this month, I think, that argued that, or I guess showed evidence that general math ability is shaped by cultural needs, so it's not, which like, are there other aspects of these species other than their vocalizations that might lead to the problem solving ability?
Yeah, so is there a third variable, a mediator variable that's actually causing this?
So famously in linguistics, Chomsky talks about third factors, which basically are third.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the fact that you just said third thing.
Yeah.
They're gonna make a linguist out of you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I know this is not your paper also, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, just
And I've only skimmed it once.
Sure, yeah.
Is the other thing. And honestly, I think no. And the reason why is like I mentioned before, the only things that more complex song has really been linked to as explanations for why they might be preferred by females in some species is that it reflects the cognitive abilities of the male, and because it just has a huge metabolic cost, so it reflects the male's general ability to deal with those costs. There have been like no other factors like the type of nests they build, the type of habitat they live in that are convincing. So in this study, they're really like restricting their analysis to all of the factors that have clear causal links with song. So I think it's unlikely. I think it's very unlikely. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. All right, let's give Mason a round of applause. Thank you for sticking around and taking all these questions.
Oh, of course, it was a lot of fun, and it was great to get all of the linguistic feedback because I'm completely new to this
Well, I
stuff.
think what Jordan is pointing out is that, you're looking in the linguistic literature to find people who are looking at efficiency and how it shapes, and then you're finding like Kirby and I guess you mentioned Tomasello and there's the guy you cited in your paper that's, I can't remember the name right now. But they have a different perspective than I think the one you're actually presenting, right? Because
They have the loudest perspective.
they have a very causal approach where they're trying to, which is what Jordan was saying before, where you're talking more about an emergent. So there's a different. It's like where's the cart and where's the horse?
I actually think that Kirby is. I think that Kirby and I have the same perspective because this is from a Kirby paper, and this is definitely my perspective.
So I guess my caution is this is very high level. There are a lot of details in those arrows and those blobs.
Yeah.
So I strongly disagree with Kirby, and I strongly disagree with people, I don't know, like Griffiths or something. But I also agree with that.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, too vague to be particularly diagnostic.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean the thing is, so honestly, I'm struggling with the framing of this paper because there are just so many asterisks for each of these linguistic laws and all the causal mechanisms and stuff that I feel like a lot of it I just have to gloss over, and I think a part of that is like.
So what do you think is the best way to try to to frame it, to draw like a
To cast people like Kirby, I read a lot of like their older stuff, like underlying their methods. In more evolutionary terms, they're extremely like uber adaptationist.
Yeah.
So they'll say that everything you see is explained by an adaptation due to the people acting as agents making choices. They're also very teleological about it. So I just think that if that's the perspective you want to take, then they're good to compare against. But really, I don't know. The other thing that bugs me in a lot of literature on animal communication comparing it to human.
I know, we're like way over time, that's why.
Thank you, bye.
Is there?
Thank you.
I'm gonna stick around.
There's been a
Teach the linguists.
There's been an obsession with Zipf's law. Like I've read like primate communication stuff at all, that they show these Zip distributions.
Oh yeah.
And it's just, in a sense, it's not that interesting.
I completely agree. I mean, before I did this project, I was like, oh my gosh, another paper on power laws. I'm so tired of these power law papers. And I'm still like the two analyses of Zipf's law and Minzrath's law, to me, are the least interesting parts of this paper. Even the small world structure, not very interesting to me. I think the mutual information decay stuff is most interesting to me.
So I think there is also interesting in terms of they're characterizing descriptively what the birds are doing at that level. And then you can draw other inferences from that. It's the framing that goes from, oh, they show these distributions and patterns and anything opening you to this like causal reading, I think in the linguistics literature it will be read causally. If Kirby were to read your paper, if you were to watch this presentation, I'm positive that's the conclusion that would have been drawn.
That the
That the birds are
They're optimizing for
Yeah,
human efficiency, and
are
that's why
with
you get these laws.
Yeah, are with asterisks because they don't want to be called out in the literature optimizing for efficiency.
Okay, so I see what you mean now. I'm definitely in between the two perspectives, and that, like, the way I think about it is, like, early on in the evolution of bird song, you just have signals passing through the environment are more likely to be perceived, higher, lower cost, easier, harder to learn. And then as soon as those external pressures reach a point where they're meaningful in terms of fitness outcomes, I would expect species to start to evolve cognitive biases in response that, for lack of a better phrase, reduce the friction of that process. So selective learning is one of those.
I think, is this the Baldwin effect?
Yeah.
It's like the Baldwin effect, right, where the,
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And I think like the bias for more complex syllables I found in the previous project is an example of this in the opposite direction, where it's increasing the cost because of the female preferences. But I would expect there to be plenty of other biases in the direction of efficiency that are more subtle, that guide birds towards the most efficient outcomes, like the house finches who are trained on the canary trills, doing the trill but doing it slower and for less time, I think is an example of a subtle bias towards efficiency that they have. But because they aren't humans, I definitely don't think that there are the sorts of like purposeful causal biases that like Simon Kirby would talk about when talking about an iterated learning study.
Yeah, so I think this is just, at least from what I've noticed, an issue in crosstalk across the disciplines.
Yeah.
Where like the linguist is assuming like the most high school level idea of adaptation driving optimization, when obviously people in evolution are not doing that. And so I wonder if it goes the other way. So like when I saw the Gruber formula with sums that are not calculable by the individual, as we know that doesn't stop people in linguistics from proposing that sort of thing. So
Gotcha.
I don't know if you've read stuff that had summations like that, if you would interpret it as differently from how it was being written. Because like, again, it seems insane to me that you could assume that the individual speaker can calculate the lifetime cost and benefit and use that in their decision making.
Yeah.
As opposed to the in the moment cost.
Yeah. I should probably just include a brief sentence that efficiency formula is playing out over the course of biological evolution.
Yeah. I think
Rather
that would
than-
clarify things quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Because as a non-linguist, I wouldn't have even.
well, I mean, these are,
Thought
so
about it.
linguistics is a field that, it's very fractured in a way. There's many different, sub areas and disciplines and different camps and so on. And so there are debates that are sort of raging within the linguistic literature about these
Yeah.
things. And then I think, sort of not being aware of what those things are, then, that's a sense in which the cross-disciplinary talk, you might be talking to you might be connected with some camp, but you don't know how it relates to all the other camps or the whole debate there. So in some sense, you can, so it's good to have this kind of discussion so you can, at least put some sentences in your paper that.
I really like drawing analyses with human language and birdsong. In a sense,
Yeah.
they have things in common with each other that you just don't see too much around the animal world, right?
Yeah.
Even though, because they are also very different.
Yeah, and I want to study that Steinberger paper actually, son. If you want to talk about it at some
Awesome.
point, I'd like to do that because
I would love to, yeah.
there's another paper that came out, 7 years earlier that was arguing that a lot of the birdsong is actually more like the phonology than the syntax because it's more Markovian, doesn't have the hierarchical structure.
Yeah,
And
that paper,
it was Berwick and Kazuoya.
yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember the Japanese guy's name, but it was
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of curious what, so Steinberger seems to be saying something different than that, which is that actually they do seem to have evidence of this hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
And, actually what, when you mentioned the generative grammar stuff, that's exactly what I know a lot about, like, I'm totally, like that's the part that I know about.
I actually read a couple of your papers working on this paper.
Okay, and then the way you make these transition networks is basically, like I know exactly what you're doing now. When you said you're just taking two nodes and if they're connected by an edge, like all that stuff, I totally get. I know exactly what's happening there, but that's making everything very Markovian actually. Like it's not giving you any hierarchical structure at all.
Well, what's interesting is the critique of the Markovian explanations of birdsong is that they weren't taking into account long-range dependencies. Because if you only look 10 or even 20 out, it looks like it's produced by a Markov chain. Because it's those long-range dependencies that are hierarchical. And
well, yes and no. I mean, so as it turns out, not all long-range dependencies are hierarchical. So some are and some aren't. And so
yeah, I mean that's why like here the combination you still have like the sum of the long distance of the long range dependencies that are hierarchical plus those that are Markovian is what leads to this decay curve. So it's including that.
Well, I'd like to. I mean, I'd like to study this paper, and then I'll be happy to talk to you about it because I'd like to know. I mean, it's nice that they actually made generative grammar and generated data and then did the measurements. That actually would be great. But a lot will depend on what grammars they used and all the issues, right? Because even these structures here, like this isn't necessarily. I mean, this looks hierarchical, but this is also, in some sense, just a Markovian thing. Like, that's a Markovian thing. This one, okay, maybe that's what's going on there. But, like there's, anyway, I mean, we should talk about this. I'd love to talk about this more.
I would too, and thank you so much for your thoughts. It's good, and it's also good that I gave this talk in front of a bunch of linguists and no one got angry.
Well, yeah,
I'm happy about that, because And
there was nothing wrong that was said, except for a zip-song abbreviation being the most clearly one with an adaptive account.
Interesting, yeah.
And so that was a huge red flag for me.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I'll make sure to address
There's
that.
sort of multiple things that can cause a Zipfian type of effect.
All of these distributions have so many things that can cause them. It would almost be surprising not to find them. Really.
Yeah, so like
I mean, I feel that way about the rank frequency law after reading the literature. It just feels like a mess. I'm like,
that's the one that's gotten the most focus, but the same can be said about the others.
Yeah, it's true for the others too. Yeah.
Like I think it's still nice to show it, but there's just not much that can be read into it.
Yeah, it's hard to draw conclusions from that.
Could you email me a couple of the good papers in that area?
Yeah, and so actually I've done some work in this area as well.
Cool.
Yeah, this is Jordan from linguistics.
Email me that too.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I don't.
Oh, is there something else going on here?
No,
did a whole seminar last semester,
Yeah.
looking at claims of efficiency
I
in
know.
language.
I know.
And it turned out to,
I'm
it
not
all
the friend of these.
evaporates.
Okay, you know one of them.
Like, it's like just it's logically poor work and like, and strange allusions to evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, just adaptation equals evolution. Therefore, everything we see has an adaptive explanation in language.
This is the spandrel, right?
Yeah, so what's striking to me about the spandrel paper is that, like, I think there's plenty to criticize as it applies in evolution. Like, it's painting the field in too bad of a light, but it fits perfectly to claims of adaptation in language. So like all the things that paper says don't do, and then people in evolution says, okay, we don't usually do this. People are proud of doing it in the linguistic literature.
Interesting.
Right?
So many linguists sort of have, you know, maybe they've misread the literature of evolution and they sort of have learned the wrong lessons and brought it in, right? And so
There's been a lot of, so there's the evolution of language and there's the evolution of languages, which are different, but conceptually related. And the filter down to the evolution of languages has turned itself into this like purely adaptive thing, where if there is a trait, therefore it was adapted, and we just have to find the adaptation.
Are you talking, so I just finished up a postdoc that was, where I was like technically affiliated with Russell Gray's department at the MPI in Leipzig that publishes all of the big linguistic phylogenies and causal hypotheses about political complexity. So is that the stuff you're talking about?
I'm not familiar with political complexities work. I am familiar with this linguistic phylogeny work, and there's a completely different criticism to be made.
Oh, I know all
There.
about those criticisms.
Which is, it's
didn't
different,
think
but
about
that's taking methods from like computational phylogeny developed in biology and inappropriately applying them to language.
Yeah.
Which is like due to the substance of what's changing, which is, I think, like almost complementary to this criticism. Like it's a completely different issue.
Yeah.
But I still read those papers. I think they're interesting.
I liked the most recent, the new, I don't know if it's published yet, but Quentin Atkinson's new Bayesian phylogeny of Indo-European that includes horizontal transmission. I found quite to be like a huge improvement.
Yeah. So like, what I like about those papers is entirely the methodologies. They fall flat because of how they are determining and comparing the characters, rather than everything that comes after. So it's like falling flat on the first step and then doing everything else brilliantly.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're happy with the generative models of the phylogenies themselves, but it's the data that the models have been fit
it's
to?
entirely the substance of the data.
Interesting.
Which is different from the efficiency people who have, like I don't doubt their data. You can't draw these conclusions from the data. So it's right, they're like complementary, they're opposite.
Interesting.
That's really interesting. I haven't heard that critique and I like it.
I'll send you, I think I can find a linguistic critique of Gray and Atkins.
Are you set up in an office here somewhere?
Yeah, I'm the first row of the big room.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
But yeah, thank you for checking out that paper. I would
Yeah,
love
I'll
to
be in
talk
touch,
about
and
it.
I'm kind of,
Awesome.
I can't really commit to anything, so I'm kind of
Oh, of course.
refusing
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
but
yeah.
are you gonna be on campus regularly, or what's your situation?
I'm actually commuting from the city, so just once a week, usually Thursdays.
Okay,
But I'm also happy to come in whenever.
okay, yeah, but I mean, Thursday should work, I'll send you an email sometime, we can meet one Thursday and talk about it.
Awesome, thank you, yeah.
That'd be great.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll send you an email with some
I'll see you later.
papers.
See ya. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
No, this was very interesting.
Yeah. Awesome discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for the talk.